Fantastic. Really helpful. Thank you very much. Peter, what is covenant theology?
Yeah, that's a big question. By summation, covenant theology is basically a system or framework of interpretation, and covenant theology tends to organize itself around three basic covenants, although there's even debate among covenant theologians about these covenants. But you have the covenant of redemption, which is the intertrinitarian covenant promise to one another about redemption. And then you have the covenant of works, which God makes with mankind, how mankind is to work for eternal life. And then mankind fails at that. And so the covenant of grace is instituted between God and man, where God promises a way of salvation, how he's going to save mankind. And now people might get after me. That's a very simplistic rendering of it, but I do think that's fair. And I, even when I talk about it in my book, I lay out, the sources from covenant theologians talking about that. And somebody who's listening or watching might say, why would you even talk about covenant theology with regard to baptism? And the reason we talk about that is because covenant theology is actually the core for how Reformed Paedobaptists argue for infant baptism. And that may surprise a lot of people, but one of the things I contend in the book is that Zwingli actually formulates covenant theology. He's everybody recognizes him, whether you're a Paedobaptist or not. Zwingli is basically the figurehead of covenant theology. He's the one who systematizes it. He's very instrumental in that. And Calvin gets a lot of the press, but Calvin just popularizes a lot of what Zwingli does. And most historians have recognized that and affirmed that. But Zwingli is the one who systematizes covenant theology, and he does so largely to fight against the Anabaptists. So covenant theology at its core is largely a pro-Paedobaptist position. And you might say, well, how does that work? Well, because in covenant theology, the covenant of grace, which is so crucial to the understanding of covenant theology, the covenant of grace is the one covenant that rules them all. And the covenant of grace is meant to solidify God's relationship with humanity and save them. And so there are different, according to covenant theologians, manifestations of that covenant of grace throughout history. It can be called the Noahic covenant. It can be called the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the new covenant. But in their mind, those are all one manifestation, or they're various manifestations of the one covenant of grace, which is unchanging in its essence. And so that's actually one of the crucial arguments for paedobaptism then, because in the Abrahamic covenant, you have the covenant of grace where God promises to save Abraham and his offspring. And to signify that covenant, you have circumcision. And so circumcision is a sign of the covenant of grace. Okay. Now, when you get to the new covenant, you have baptism replacing circumcision in this framework. And so you can see, at least in the system, yes, that there's this supposed consistency where you have baptism replacing circumcision as the sign of that covenant. And so it too then would be given to the children of believers, just like you saw in Abraham, because it's the same covenant of grace in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Now, I should clarify too that Reformed Baptists hold to a very different variation of covenant theology. And so they would be upset if I didn't make this disclaimer, saying that they would differentiate the covenant of grace as being identified only with the new covenant. And so that's how they're able to argue against infant baptism. But in my mind, just honestly, not being a covenant theologian, I think they do so a little precariously. I don't think covenant theology is a great way to argue against infant baptism, since it was designed to kind of propagate that view anyway.